February 20th, 1944. 1,347 hours. 23,000 feet above Nazi-occupied France. Second Lieutenant Thomas Hargrove sat in the pilot's seat of a B-17 flying fortress that was no longer flying and was rapidly becoming less of a fortress. The bomber, designated Lucky Strike by its crew in what now seemed like dangerous optimism, had taken a direct hit from German flak over the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. The explosion had torn through the aircraft's midsection, shredding hydraulic lines, severing control cables, and punching a hole in the fuselage large enough to see through. Cold air screamed through the opening at 200 miles per hour. The instrument panel in front of Hargrove showed 3 engines still running, which should have been enough to get them home. The problem was that the control surfaces weren't responding correctly. The bomber was losing altitude at 500 feet per minute, and Hargrove was running out of altitude, options, and time. Hargrove hadn't planned on being a pilot. 2 years earlier, he'd been a carpenter in Portland, Oregon, building houses and reading blueprints and learning the trade from his father, who'd built half the residential homes in their neighborhood. Thomas had grown up understanding how structures worked, how load transferred through joists and beams, how materials behaved under stress. When he'd enlisted in early 1942, the Army Air Corps had tested him and discovered he had good spatial reasoning and steady hands. They'd put him through flight school, taught him to fly multi-engine bombers, and by December 1943 he was in England as part of the 8th Air Force, flying missions over Germany in a 4-engine bomber that weighed 32 tons when fully loaded and required constant attention to keep in the air even when nothing was shooting at it. This was Hargrove's 14th mission. The target had been the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, critical to German war production, and defended by some of the heaviest anti-aircraft concentrations in Europe. The mission planners had known it would be costly. What they hadn't anticipated was just how accurate the German flak would be. Lucky Strike had been in the formation approaching the target when the shell had detonated just below and behind the aircraft. The explosion had lifted the bomber, shaken it like a toy, and filled the interior with smoke and the smell of burning metal. Hargrove's co-pilot, Lieutenant Davies, had immediately started running through emergency procedures while Hargrove fought to keep the aircraft level. The initial damage assessment had been bad but survivable. 3 crew members wounded, none critically. 2 engines running rough but functional. Hydraulic pressure dropping but still adequate. Hargrove had turned the bomber toward England, tucked it into the protection of the formation, and prepared for a long, tense flight home. Then, 10 minutes later, the real problem had revealed itself. The elevator controls, the system that controlled the aircraft's pitch, its ability to climb or descend, were becoming increasingly unresponsive. Hargrove would pull back on the yoke and get minimal response. Push forward, and the nose would drop too far. The bomber was becoming unflyable, and they were still 150 miles from the English Channel. Davies had gone back to inspect the damage while Hargrove maintained what control he could. What he'd found made both pilots' blood run cold. The flak hit had severed one of the primary elevator control cables, a thick steel cable that ran from the cockpit back through the fuselage to the tail section where it connected to the elevator surfaces. That cable was what translated the pilot's control inputs into actual aircraft movement. With it severed, they were trying to fly a bomber that weighed over 60,000 pounds using only the backup cable, which was now taking loads it was never designed to handle. Davies reported that the backup cable was already showing signs of fraying. If it snapped completely, they would lose all elevator control. The bomber would enter an uncontrollable dive, and 10 men would ride it down to impact with the French countryside at terminal velocity. Standard procedure in this situation was clear: abandon aircraft. The B-17 had escape hatches and the crew had parachutes. If the aircraft was becoming unflyable, you didn't try to save it. You saved the crew. Hargrove understood the logic. He'd been trained on it extensively. But he also understood something the training manuals didn't account for. They were over occupied France, and 3 of his crew members were wounded badly enough that they couldn't jump. The bombardier, Sergeant Mitchell, had taken shrapnel in both legs. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Lopez, had a head wound that had left him semi-conscious. The radio operator, Corporal Chun, had burns on his hands severe enough that he couldn't operate his parachute. If Hargrove gave the order to bail out, he'd be condemning 3 men to either death on impact or capture, and probable death in German captivity, given their injuries. Lieutenant Davies looked at him. "Tom, we can't control this aircraft." That backup cable is going to snap. When it does, we're done. Hargrove kept his hands on the yoke, feeling the sluggish response, the way the bomber wanted to drop its nose despite his inputs. How long do we have? Davies checked his watch, did some mental calculation. Based on the rate of fraying I saw, maybe 20 minutes. Probably less. 20 minutes. They were making about 200 miles per hour, which meant they could cover maybe 60 miles before the cable failed. That would get them closer to friendly territory, but not close enough. They'd still be over France when they lost control. Hargrove looked at his instrument panel, at the altimeter showing 21,000 feet, at the compass heading that pointed northwest toward England in safety. Then he made a decision that violated every regulation about aircraft emergencies, but was consistent with everything he'd learned about structures and load, and how materials failed. "I'm going to fix it," he said. Davies stared at him. "Fix what?" "Tom, you can't splice a control cable in flight. It's not possible." Hargrove was already unbuckling his harness. "I'm not going to splice it. I'm going to bypass it." He called back to the engineer, Sergeant Kowalski, who was stationed at the top turret position. "Ski, I need you to look at that severed cable. Tell me exactly where it's cut and what the geometry looks like." Kowalski made his way back through the damaged fuselage, stepping carefully around the hole where cold air howled through. 2 minutes later, his voice crackled over the intercom. "Lieutenant, the cable is cut clean about 15 feet forward of the tail section. The severed ends are maybe 3 feet apart. The backup cable is running parallel about 6 inches to the left, and it's definitely fraying where it passes through a pulley mount." Hargrove closed his eyes and visualized it. He'd spent years building houses, running structural cables, understanding how tension and load worked in three-dimensional space. A control cable was just a structural element under tension, no different in principle from the cables that supported loads in construction. The primary cable was severed with a 3-foot gap. The backup cable was taking too much load and starting to fail. What he needed was a way to either reconnect the primary cable or reinforce the backup cable so it could handle the load without failing. But he couldn't reconnect the primary cable. There was no way to splice a steel cable under tension at altitude with the tools available. So he needed to reinforce the backup cable to add a parallel load path that would take some of the stress off the fraying section. He needed something rigid enough to span the gap and strong enough to handle the loads involved. Something that could be attached to the cable system and provide additional support. Something they actually had on board a bomber that was carrying nothing but ammunition, bombs that had already been dropped, and the personal equipment of 10 crew members. Hargrove thought about the materials available. Metal structural elements from the aircraft itself, too difficult to remove and repurpose. Ammunition boxes, not strong enough. Parachute harnesses, wrong material properties. Then his carpenter's mind landed on something obvious. The aircraft had wooden structural elements. Not many. The B-17 was mostly aluminum and steel, but there were wooden components in certain areas. And more importantly, there were wooden components in the crew's personal equipment. "Ski, do we still have the emergency escape ladder?" Every B-17 carried a folding wooden ladder for emergency ground evacuation. It was stored near the waist gunner positions, a simple construction of wooden rungs and side rails, maybe 8 feet long when extended. Kowalski confirmed they had it. Hargrove was already moving. "Get it out. Bring it back to the tail section. Davies, you have the aircraft." Davies grabbed the controls, his face showing he understood this was insane, but also understood they were out of better options. "I've got it. Tom, whatever you're planning, do it fast. This thing is getting harder to control." Hargrove made his way back through the fuselage. The interior of a B-17 in flight was a miserable environment even under good conditions. Cramped, cold, loud, filled with the smell of oil and cordite. With a hole torn in the side and wounded men bleeding on the floor, it was approaching hell. He reached the tail section where Kowalski was waiting with the wooden ladder. The severed control cable was visible, 2 thick steel cables that had once been connected, now ending in frayed metal flowers 3 feet apart. The backup cable ran parallel, visibly stressed, thin wisps of broken wire showing where it was starting to fail at a pulley point. The principle was simple. Hargrove needed to create a rigid connection that would span from a secure point on the fuselage structure to the backup cable, providing additional support and taking load off the failing section. The wooden ladder was perfect, it was rigid, it was strong in compression, and it could be positioned to create a triangular brace. He'd used similar principles 100 times in construction, installing support structures to reinforce loads. The challenge was doing it at 20,000 feet in a vibrating aircraft with control surfaces that were barely responding and a crew depending on him to work fast. He broke down the ladder, separating the side rails from the rungs. The side rails were straight pieces of hardwood, about 6 feet long, 2 inches wide, 1 inch thick. Strong enough to handle significant compression loads if the geometry was right. He positioned one rail at an angle, running from a structural bulkhead in the fuselage to a point on the backup cable just forward of where it was fraying. The idea was to create a support that would push against the cable from below, taking some of the tension load and converting it to compression load on the wooden rail. But he needed to secure it, needed something that would hold the rail in position against the forces involved. He used parachute cord. It was all he had. Standard issue parachute cord, rated to 550 pounds, completely inadequate for the loads involved except that he wasn't using one strand, he was using dozens. He wrapped the cord around the rail and the cable and the bulkhead structure, creating a web of reinforcement, distributing the load across multiple strands. It was crude. It was improvised. It absolutely violated every principle of proper aircraft maintenance. But Hargrove had built enough structures to understand that sometimes strength came not from individual components, but from how those components worked together. A single strand of parachute cord would fail under these loads. 50 strands working in parallel could handle forces that would surprise most engineers. He worked for 8 minutes, his hands numb from the cold, his ears ringing from the engine noise, his mind focused entirely on the geometry and the load paths. He positioned the wooden rail to create maximum mechanical advantage, angling it so the compression forces would be distributed along its length rather than concentrated at stress points. He secured it with layer after layer of parachute cord, checking each connection, visualizing how the forces would flow through the improvised structure. Finally, he wrapped additional cord around the fraying section of the backup cable itself, providing direct reinforcement to the area that was failing. When he finished, the assembly looked like something built by a person who had no idea what they were doing. A wooden ladder rail secured with parachute cord, propping up a control cable in a damaged bomber. It looked fragile. It looked temporary. It looked like it would fail the moment any real stress was applied to it. Hargrove climbed back to the cockpit and took the controls from Davies. "Okay, let's see if this works." He pulled back gently on the yoke. The bomber's nose came up. Smoothly. Responsively. More response than he'd had before the improvised repair. He pushed forward slightly. The nose dropped, exactly as it should. He tested the controls more aggressively, feeling the aircraft respond, feeling the wooden brace in the tail section taking load off the failing cable and distributing it through the fuselage structure. Davies was staring at him. "What did you do back there?" Hargrove didn't take his eyes off the instruments. "I braced the cable. Same principle as bracing a load-bearing beam in a house. You add support where the structure is weak." Davies shook his head slowly. "That's not in any manual I've ever read." Hargrove allowed himself a slight smile. "I know. Let's not tell anyone until after we land." They flew northwest, climbing back to altitude now that Hargrove had better control authority. The formation had continued without them. Standing orders were that formations didn't slow down or break up for damaged aircraft. Lucky Strike was alone in hostile airspace, a crippled bomber trying to make it back to England on 3 engines, and an improvised repair that shouldn't work but somehow was working. The flight back took 90 minutes. Every minute, Hargrove expected to feel the controls go slack, expected the wooden brace to fail, expected the backup cable to snap despite the reinforcement. But the improvised structure held. The wooden rail, positioned correctly, was taking compression load off the cable. The parachute cord, distributed across dozens of strands, was handling tension forces that would have snapped any single strand instantly. And the backup cable, relieved of some of its load by the brace, stopped fraying and held together. It was working because the geometry was right, because the load paths made sense, because Hargrove understood structures well enough to improvise a solution that worked even if it wasn't elegant. They crossed the English Channel at 15,000 feet. The white cliffs of Dover appeared through the haze, the most beautiful sight Hargrove had ever seen. He radioed ahead to their base at Thorpe Abbotts, informing them of the damage and requesting priority landing clearance. The tower controller asked if they could make it to the field. Hargrove looked at his instruments, felt the aircraft responding to his inputs, thought about the wooden brace holding together in the tail section, and said yes. They could make it. They lined up for final approach 30 minutes later. Hargrove flew it manually. The damaged hydraulics made the automatic systems unreliable. He brought the bomber down at 120 miles per hour, touched the main wheels onto the runway as gently as he could manage, and let the aircraft roll to a stop. When the engines shut down and the propellers stopped turning, the silence was overwhelming. Hargrove sat in the pilot's seat for a long moment, hands still on the yoke, letting the adrenaline drain away. They'd made it. All 10 crew members were alive. 3 were wounded, but would recover. The bomber was damaged but reparable. And somewhere in the tail section was a wooden ladder rail and a bunch of parachute cord that had kept them from becoming another statistic in the casualty reports. Davies looked at him. "Tom, when they ask what happened, what are you going to tell them?" Hargrove unbuckled his harness. "The truth. We had a control failure. I improvised a repair. We made it home." The maintenance crews who inspected Lucky Strike were confused at first, then impressed, then concerned. The engineering officer, a captain named Morrison, examined Hargrove's improvised brace for 10 minutes before saying anything. When he finally spoke, his tone was careful. "Lieutenant, this is completely outside any approved repair procedure. You understand that?" Hargrove, exhausted and just wanting to check on his wounded crew members, nodded. "Yes, sir. But the approved procedure was to abandon aircraft, and I had 3 men who couldn't jump." Morrison looked at the wooden rail, at the parachute cord wrapped around it, at the backup cable that showed clear signs of fraying, but had held together. "Did you calculate the load factors? Did you know this would work?" Hargrove shook his head. "I didn't calculate anything. I just understood the principles. The cable needed support. I provided support. The geometry made sense." Morrison wrote up a report that was careful in its language. He described the damage to Lucky Strike, the severed primary control cable, the fraying backup cable. He noted that the aircraft had returned to base with field-expedient repairs to the elevator control system. He documented the use of non-standard materials configured to provide structural reinforcement. What he didn't do was recommend any disciplinary action or suggest that Hargrove had violated regulations. Instead, he forwarded the report to the engineering section with a note suggesting they examine the repair technique for possible broader application. The note was ignored. The Army Air Forces had technical manuals and approved procedures for aircraft repairs. They didn't need carpenters improvising solutions with wooden ladders. But word spread through the bomber squadrons anyway. Pilots talked to each other. They shared stories about what worked, about solutions that weren't in the manual, about the times when improvisation saved lives. The story of Lucky Strike and the wooden brace became one of those stories, passed around in quiet conversations in officers' clubs and crew briefings. Other pilots started thinking differently about damage and repairs, started understanding that sometimes the solution wasn't in the technical manual, but in understanding basic principles of how structures worked. There was never an official training bulletin. There was never any formal acknowledgement that improvised repairs might be necessary or effective. But the knowledge spread anyway, through the unofficial channels that made combat crews effective. Over the next 6 months, there were at least 4 documented cases of B-17 crews making improvised repairs to control systems during flight. One crew used a rifle cleaning rod to bridge a broken linkage. Another used parts from a crew member's metal cot to reinforce a damaged control surface. A third used chains from cargo tie-downs to replace severed cables. None of these repairs were in any manual. All of them worked well enough to get damaged aircraft back to friendly territory, and all of them could be traced back, through the chain of shared knowledge and borrowed techniques, to the principle that Thomas Hargrove had demonstrated, that understanding how forces worked mattered more than having the right parts, that improvised solutions could be effective if the geometry was sound, and that sometimes saving lives meant ignoring the regulations and using whatever materials were available. Hargrove flew 16 more missions before his tour was complete. Lucky Strike was repaired and returned to service, eventually completing over 80 missions before the end of the war. The wooden brace was removed during repairs and discarded, just a piece of ladder rail and some parachute cord, not worth saving. Hargrove finished his combat tour in August 1944, returned to the United States, and was assigned to training duties where he taught new pilots how to handle emergencies. He never mentioned the wooden brace in his instruction. The approved curriculum didn't include improvised repairs, and Hargrove had learned that institutions weren't interested in solutions that came from outside their established procedures. He was discharged in October 1945 with the rank of captain and a Distinguished Flying Cross that cited extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. The citation didn't mention the wooden brace or the improvised repair or the 3 wounded crew members who would have died if Hargrove had followed standard procedure and ordered the crew to abandon aircraft. It just noted that he had displayed exceptional skill and courage in returning a severely damaged aircraft to base. That was true. That was enough for the official record. But the men who had been on lucky strike that day knew the full story. They knew that their pilot had ignored regulations, improvised a solution, and saved their lives by understanding structures well enough to fix a bomber with a ladder and some rope. Hargrove went back to Portland and returned to carpentry. The post-war housing boom meant there was plenty of work. He built houses for returning veterans, installed roof trusses and floor joists, did the same work he'd done before the war. When people asked about his service, he said he'd been a bomber pilot in Europe. That was true. That was all most people needed to know. He didn't talk about the missions or the flak or the friends who hadn't come back. He certainly didn't talk about the wooden brace. It seemed too specific, too technical, too difficult to explain to people who hadn't been there and couldn't understand why it mattered. In 1952, he hired his first employee. In 1958, he opened a second location. By 1965, Hargrove Construction was one of the larger builders in the Portland area, known for quality work and innovative solutions to difficult problems. Thomas Hargrove had a reputation for being able to look at a construction challenge and find an approach that other builders missed, for understanding structures well enough to improvise when standard methods didn't work. His employees learned that if there was a problem, you showed it to Tom, and Tom would figure out how the forces worked and find a solution. That approach, understanding principles over memorizing procedures, became the foundation of how his company operated. He retired in 1982 at the age of 62. He'd built over 300 houses, dozens of commercial buildings, and trained 2 generations of carpenters in Portland. He spent his remaining years fishing, working in his garden, and occasionally consulting on complex structural problems that his former employees would bring to him. He died in 1998 at the age of 78. His obituary mentioned his construction business and his military service as a bomber pilot, but provided no details about specific missions or accomplishments. Just a note that he'd served with distinction and had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The wooden brace was never mentioned. The improvised repair that had saved 10 lives was never part of the public record of his life. Here's what the official histories don't capture, what the military records don't properly document, what exists only in scattered crew accounts and the fading memories of men who flew in the 8th Air Force. B-17 bombers flew some of the most dangerous missions of World War II, deep into Germany against heavy defenses, suffering catastrophic damage, and still trying to make it back to England. The official loss rates were staggering. Over 4,000 B-17s lost in combat, tens of thousands of crew members killed. But for every aircraft that was lost, there were others that made it back despite damage that should have been fatal. Some of those survivals came from luck. Some came from extraordinary piloting skill. And some came from improvised repairs made by crew members who understood principles well enough to fix aircraft in flight using whatever materials were available. The Army Air Forces never officially acknowledged that improvised repairs were happening. There was no update to the technical manuals. There was no training provided on field-expedient solutions. The institutional preference was always for proper procedure and approved methods. But the pilots and crews knew better. They knew that sometimes you couldn't follow procedure, that sometimes the manual didn't have an answer for the specific problem you were facing, that sometimes staying alive meant improvising. And they shared that knowledge through unofficial channels, through the stories they told each other, through the techniques they passed along in conversations that no historian recorded. Thomas Hargrove's wooden brace was one example of that unofficial knowledge. It wasn't the only example. It wasn't even the most dramatic example. But it represented something important about how military operations actually work versus how institutions claim they work. The official narrative is that success comes from training, proper equipment, and following established procedures. The reality is that success often comes from individual initiative, practical knowledge, and the willingness to ignore established procedures when circumstances demand it. Hargrove wasn't a trained aircraft engineer. He was a carpenter who understood structures. That understanding, applied to a problem that aircraft engineers would have said was unsolvable without proper tools and parts, kept a bomber flying and saved 10 lives. The broader lesson extends beyond one aircraft and one mission. Military aviation, like all complex technical fields, tends to become rigid in its thinking. Engineers design systems, write manuals, establish procedures, and then expect those procedures to cover every situation. But combat produces situations that no engineer anticipated, problems that no manual addresses, damage patterns that weren't in the design specifications. In those moments, the people who survive are often the ones who understand principles well enough to improvise, who can look beyond the approved solutions to see what might actually work, who have practical experience with materials and forces and structures that lets them create solutions from whatever is available. Vincent Castellano had that understanding with plumbing and structural support. Thomas Hargrove had it with carpentry and load-bearing structures. Both of them found themselves in situations where their civilian knowledge applied to military problems in ways that formal military training didn't cover. Both of them improvised solutions that worked despite violating regulations. Both of them saved lives by understanding that sometimes the mission required you to ignore what you'd been told was impossible and just solve the problem in front of you. And both of them went back to their civilian lives after the war without any real recognition of what they'd done, without any acknowledgement that their contributions had mattered. That's how most innovation actually happens. Not through laboratories and research programs and formal development processes, though those certainly have their place, but through individual people facing immediate problems with inadequate resources and the practical knowledge to see solutions that experts miss. The institutions eventually learn from these innovations, though they rarely credit the people who demonstrated them. The techniques get absorbed into doctrine, written up in updated manuals, presented as if they were always part of the approved approach. And the individual stories, the carpenter who braced a control cable with a wooden ladder, the plumber who supported a bridge with a drain pipe, the radio operator who fixed an antenna with a clothesline, those stories get lost in the institutional memory. Thomas Hargrove fixed a B-17 with a wooden ladder. That's what happened. Everything else, the lives saved, the knowledge spread, the techniques adopted by other crews, all of that was just the result of one pilot understanding that a control cable needed support and having the practical knowledge to provide that support with the materials available. He wasn't trying to revolutionize aircraft maintenance. He wasn't trying to prove that regulations were inadequate. He was just trying to get his crew home alive, and he happened to have the background and the insight to see a solution that worked even though it wasn't in any manual. There's no memorial to Captain Thomas Hargrove at the Air Force Museum. There's no display about improvised aircraft repairs in World War II. His contribution to aviation safety exists only in a brief engineering report, in the memories of the crew members who flew with him, and in the unofficial knowledge that spread through bomber squadrons about what was possible when you understood principles instead of just following procedures. But for 90 minutes on February 20th, 1944, a wooden ladder rail held together the elevator controls of a crippled bomber and kept it flying long enough to reach safety. And that simple improvised brace, installed in 8 minutes by a pilot who understood structures, represents the truth about how problems actually get solved when official solutions aren't available, through practical knowledge, clear thinking, and the courage to try something that experts would say couldn't possibly work. That wooden brace saved 10 lives. The 3 wounded men who couldn't have bailed out survived, received medical treatment, and eventually recovered. The rest of the crew completed their combat tours and went home. Some of them stayed in touch with Hargrove after the war. Some of them told their families about the pilot who had saved them with a ladder. But those were private stories, shared in living rooms and at reunions, not the kind of stories that make it into history books or official records. And in the gap between what actually happened and what gets remembered, the truth about innovation and problem-solving and the real nature of heroism disappears. Thomas Hargrove understood structures. The Army Air Forces needed someone who understood structures, even though they didn't realize it until a bomber came back with an improvised brace in its tail section. And for one critical mission, that carpenter's practical knowledge made the difference between 10 men dying over France and 10 men making it home to England. That's the real story. Not a tale of impossible heroism or dramatic rescue, but the quieter truth about how essential problems get solved by ordinary people with practical skills who understand principles well enough to improvise when circumstances demand it. The wooden brace worked. The bomber landed safely. The crew survived. And somewhere in Portland, years later, a retired pilot built houses and never mentioned that he'd once saved 10 lives by understanding that a control cable was just another structural element that needed support, and that sometimes the solution was as simple as a piece of wood positioned correctly.